I'd first like to start by thanking the organizing committee for, first of all, inviting me and putting all of this hard work into this amazing event. It's always amazing to be part of something like this because you kind of take a lot of lessons away. You know, I think for us, it's as speakers, it's as exciting to be here as it perhaps is for everyone else. You know, we also get a lot of knowledge out of this. I come from Cape Town, which is a long way from KK. You can kind of see Cape Town down there, and KK on the other side of the world. So it's great to be here. I'm going to start maybe by being a little bit. Well, I'll try and be cynical if I can get this to work. I'm going to start just by saying that, especially for the young people coming up into the industry, I think often these kinds of discussions that we have are kind of limited to our own group. And as a result of that, I think we're kind of largely invisible to society, and we have very little impact on society. And one of the big challenges we have, particularly in the third world, is that we completely marginalized from any engagement with the way most people in our countries actually live. You know, in South Africa, for instance, since the end of apartheid, the government's delivered about 4 million houses to deal with the very real housing crisis that we have, without a single architect being involved. And the result is, you know, terribly poor environments that lock in poverty rather than provide any real opportunity or access to the economy. And you end up with these kinds of environments, and you end up with this kind of disconnect, where there's no vision, there are no linkages, there are no opportunities. And I think our challenge and your challenge is to convince politicians and developers that we can add value to society. And I often think that perhaps we should be politicians as much as architects, and get kind of more engaged in actually making a difference. Particularly in where I come from, you know, our societies are very young and are growing at tremendous rates, and it's almost a structural impossibility to accommodate people in any kind of discussion about quality environments, particularly because we're essentially so excluded. And where I come from, architecture is really something for wealthy people. It's not for poor people. I think in Malaysia it's a little bit different, but I think it is something that people have to be very wary of. So that's a challenge for you guys for the future. I grew up in a country that was very cut off from the world because of our politics. Before the internet, and because we're geographically disconnected from the world. You know, before the internet, our only exposure to contemporary architecture was through 3 or 4 architectural magazines that we got at our university library, and through books, which would, of course, only arrive a year or 2 after buildings had been completed. Today, the internet has given us complete access to the world and has allowed us to engage with it, and it's been an amazing change. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our practice first today, and about how we work, and then show you some of the work that we do. Our background is in residential work, and these have been really great projects to explore ideas about place and space, and to understand how the combination of these 2 ideas can create extraordinary opportunities for life. This is Cape Town. It's an extraordinary city surrounded by the sea and the mountains. It was set up about 350 years ago as a provisioning station for Dutch fleets coming to this part of the world. And it's an incredibly diverse and exciting city to be in. It has many challenges, but it's South Africa is an amazing place despite our history and problems. Of interest, the city has a sizable Malay community that arrived 350 years ago when the Dutch started importing slaves and sending their political prisoners to the Cape. This is a suburb called the Boerkaap, which sits on the edge of the city, full of these beautiful little cottages and peppered with mosques. Our inspiration, our heroes, are modernist architects like South African Gawie Fagan, who has a remarkable ability to design modern buildings that understand the architectural traditions of the Cape. The Brazilian Oscar Niemeyer, whose fluid sensual forms and shapes create spaces that celebrate being alive. And architects like Paul Rudolph in the US, who had an ability to define and hold space. All of these people had an intrinsic understanding of place and culture, the idea of modernity in life, and a wonderful ability to form space that connected all of these ideas with the landscape they found themselves in. Get this to work. Place is important in any architectural design. And in South Africa, we have a tradition of buildings that have informed our work. These are the Cape Dutch buildings that date back 300 years, and they were designed to protect their inhabitants from the elements, but they had a very conscious relationship with the landscapes that they found themselves in. If you look at the gables of these buildings, often you can see the forms of the mountains kind of being reflected back into them. The other thing that's quite distinct about South Africa is that we have a very mild climates, which these were kind of quite European buildings in a way, in that they were, as I said, they protected their inhabitants from the elements, and they didn't have a particularly easy connection between inside and outside. And over time, particularly after the British arrived, Eddie, do you want to change that? You start seeing buildings like this, which are, I see some parallels in some of the colonial architecture here, with this introduction of verandas, which wrap around houses. These structures obviously protect the buildings from the sun, but you start seeing the development of outdoor living spaces, which then become very integral spaces in these structures, and people tend to actually start living outside under shelter rather than inside. And this way of living is very much informed the way that we work. That a lot of our buildings are really just about creating a shelter, but allowing a very a deep connection to the surrounding landscape and a very real connection. So you have this very ambiguous definition of what's inside and what's outside. Sciota was started by Stephen Anthony 30 years ago in a kind of he started on his own, so it's a kind of classic case of a very small studio turning into an overnight success over 30 years. And today we have, this is our office building here, and we have about 200 people in here. We have 3 businesses. We have the architecture studio Seota. We have an interior design and interior architecture studio called ARC, and then we have a furniture studio called a.k.a, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And what's also been quite interesting about our journey is we've only about 10% of our workers left in SA, and we've slowly kind of connected up into markets in Africa, and then across into other countries, and we're busy in about 40 cities at the moment. And we work on some pretty amazing projects, some of which I'll show you today, and a very broad mix from residential villas to commercial office projects, schools and universities. And we work with amazing people in these cities. I think one of the things that I've particularly enjoyed is building partnerships with consultants in other cities, and really kind of seeing how similar everyone's problems are, and how people have a fairly typical understanding of the world and how things are done. Travel is also a key component of architectural education. I think it's very important that you're open to ideas from other cultures and other cities, and you understand the problems that other places in the world have, and you take lessons from those places. Okay, spatial design. One of the problems that architects have created for themselves is thinking that they're able to solve and design buildings in isolation without working with other people. So I think successful architectural design is absolutely a team exercise, and it requires input from various fields. We kind of learned this the hard way, where we designed buildings initially at the beginning of our professional careers, which then got completely destroyed by suppliers who'd kind of do design and supply components, or by landscapers who didn't understand the architecture, or by interior designers who didn't understand what we were trying to do. And this kind of led us to starting ARC, which is the interior architecture and interior design company, so that we could have a more meaningful connection through the process. And then when we couldn't get decent furniture in South Africa, we started a furniture design company, which we designed this furniture, which is made in Cape Town. And it's exciting to be part of a kind of a design culture that's emerging in Africa, where there's some really exciting forms and silhouettes and ideas starting to emerge from the continent. We've subsequently, as I said, formed very strong relationships with landscape architects and lighting designers. And when we work on projects, we try and go into projects from the very, very beginning with quite substantial teams assembled, so that we can run design processes that get a lot of input from a lot of different people from the beginning. And of course, clients are also very important. You know, clients come to you with a requirement, and often they're very well qualified to tell you what that requirement is. I also just want to talk a little bit about the importance of systems and organization in architecture. It's a very difficult business to start with, and you find that you have to pull a whole number of strands together. And one of the things we realized quite early on is that it's actually about access to information, having the right information, and then being able to assemble that information in as logical and quicker manner as you can, and retain the value through the whole process. So we've been very careful to keep up with technology. We think that the computer is the most liberating design tool, not because it allows for complexity, but because it allows for comprehension and understanding of things that are very difficult to understand otherwise. And I can't overstate how important that's been to us. Communication's critical, communication systems are critical, and of course, people are critical. I think that's been kind of the longest build for us in a way, is finding the right people and getting the right skill set. One of the things we're very excited about at the moment is what's happening in virtual reality, and we've set up a little virtual reality lab. Part of our process is we work in Revit, and one of the very first things we do in any project is we fully, I'll get there, we fully model the landscape, because lost. Okay. Thanks, Eddie. We fully model the landscape, and we work in the landscape from day one in our design models, and it allows us to start understanding the relationship between buildings and buildings, or buildings and landscapes in a way that's really just again impossible in a 2D environment where you're guessing at relationships. Okay, I'm going to take you through some work now. Starting with some of our, okay, this is us having fun in our VR setup. And this is us, sorry Eddie, I've pushed out again. This is us pretending to be Jedi warriors. Eddie, I think let's do it by hand. Okay, so if you move on. This, next one. The first set of projects are in the private realm. The villas. This project, First Crescent, is one we did about 15 years ago. And it was one of the first projects where we started to understand that we should use roofs for shelter and walls for privacy. The site sits on these Cape Town sites are very, very dramatic. The other thing that's quite distinct about them is often the view's kind of up there through the roof, which has led us to kind of be conscious of what's going on above roofs, and also to be conscious that the sky is a view. So this site sits on a spur looking into Camps Bay. And you can, this is a section through the site. We've also become quite conscious, because we live in a place that has such fantastic views, of understanding where the best place to experience the view is. So often that's meant kind of inverting what you would normally do, where you'd put the living spaces on the ground level and the bedrooms up above. Often we actually put the living spaces kind of up into the sky, because it also allows us then to take advantage of these vertical views and bring them into the living spaces, and it heightens your visual connection to the landscape in a way that's sometimes almost cinematic. Okay. We're also quite conscious about trying to. I've just said cinematic is to create these very wide landscape views, and then to use walls to obscure surrounding buildings. Okay, So in this example, you end up with a building that from the street, you've got no sense of the view that sits beyond it, and you've got no sense of the scale of the building. And it's a very kind of closed down private access point. And then you come into this space, you start seeing these views of the sky and getting these glimpses of the mountain beyond, which kind of a clue that something's coming. And then you come into this space, which has this roof cutout, which gives you this sky view, and the sky wraps around you on both sides. And this is in a very built-up suburb of Cape Town, but your relationship is with the environment, not with the surrounding buildings. So some of what you'll see in these, some of the principles you'll see in the designs that are important to us are, firstly, a response and a connection to the site. Buildings are obviously a response to, or designs are a response to the site and a requirement for shelter. They should heighten the sense of connection between somebody who's in the house and somebody and the landscape that surrounds it. And as I've said, we're always very conscious of trying to create this sense that you're almost hovering in the landscape, and you have this very powerful connection with it. Where it's obviously not always possible to have, you don't always work in environments where you have these landscapes around you. So it's important to also understand that it's possible to invert that relationship and create courtyards and spaces inside buildings that create internal views. And then the sun's a critical element. Good space should track the sun and should manipulate the light and energy that it provides. The other thing we've learned through cutting roofs open is that you also create a relationship with the moon, which is the most surprising thing. When you're in a space and it's fairly dark and this kind of light comes on because the moon's risen and is shining into the space, it's a really magical thing. Spatial organization is also important. Simple connections, simple spaces. One of the things that we've always been very conscious of is that we start with space. We try and understand what's happening in that space. We always populate it with whatever furniture or fixtures it has in it, so we understand how people move across it relative to those elements. And then we connect the spaces, and then the building forms out of that process. So we're primarily concerned with how spaces connect, how people move through spaces, what the impact of time and movement are on your experience of those spaces, and then what the connections of those spaces are on a micro scale to a macro scale in the environment around you. We also always try to avoid using very cellular spaces or series of cellular spaces. And we try and lend and borrow spaces as much as we can, which has the effect of making spaces feel a lot larger. The other key thing you'll see in a lot of these projects is that there's a real ambiguity between what's inside and what's outside. And we do that because we're trying to create spaces where people live outside, but when they're inside, they still have a sense that they're kind of living on a veranda outside. And as I said earlier, for us, horizontal elements, floors and roofs are much more important for us than walls. These are the elements that allow space to flow inside and outside. And walls, we use walls to create privacy and edges. The other thing you'll see us doing quite a lot is trying to stretch view lines through buildings so that we if you're in a room that's, say, 6 by 6 and it's got walls on 4 sides and a window, your experience is of a space that's 6 by 6. But by cutting walls away and allowing views to either run across sites or right across to distant elements, you're simply in a shelter in a much bigger space. And you have this just amazing, I think space is one of the big luxuries that we've lost. And I think there are ways to bring space back. BAF'16 was a building in a place called Knysna, a.k.a. A beautiful city or town on the east coast of South Africa with this fantastic lagoon and these incredible bluffs onto the sea. This is an estate we did 2 houses on. Okay. So the building is approached from the back and is framed against the sea. It's clad in copper, which has by now gone green, and it sits kind of really on the edge of this bluff. The sea sits at the top of the screen, so we're very conscious of, as you come down to the building, obscuring the view of the sea. And you enter into that element numbered 1 as the entrance. You enter into an entrance where you really kind of lose your connection with the sea. But as you then come through the space, through this cross-shaped plan, it starts kind of breaking up, and you get not only the views towards the sea, but you get views back to the sides, to the landscape, and you get these very extended views through the building. So that's the approach. Okay. This is the entrance lobby where your only view is of the sky. That's from the front. So you go to this kind of from this walled environment to these very horizontal sheltering floors and walls. And here you start seeing this effect of stretching view lines through the building and borrowing space and lending space from different spaces. And you really get the sense that you're just immersed in a landscape. This is one of the bedrooms, so you get this view slot cut through here. Okay. The next project is a project called BAF'3, which we did, I think, about 2 years later, very close to this site. So it sits here looking down at a set of cliffs on this side now, which are these bluffs. It's approached a similar kind of idea. In this one, you really do kind of lose the sea as you drive down to it. One of the things we discovered is you'll see in a lot of our buildings you have these sets of steps that take you up. And of course, if you look at the horizon of the sea, it's at 1.6 or whatever your eye level above floor is. So as you kind of step back up here, you actually start raising the level of the horizon line as you read it through the glass. So in this building, as you come into the building and you look down, the whole view in front of you is really just the sea. This roof, which angles down, kind of just touches the horizon, and then as you come down, the horizon line lowers relative to the roof. It also has a series of these cutouts that give you sky views, allow sun in, allow you to view back at this set of hills behind here, and this view of the sky. And we're always very conscious of trying to use these level changes also to create opportunities for you to look down at the sea or at whatever's below you. This is the plan. So you enter at the top, down the set of stairs, and then you come into this single living space where the different spaces are really just articulated by changes in level or changes in the ceilings. You have this incredible open view angle. So that's the back with a glimpse of the sea. And then this big sheltering roof over you. One of the key ideas here was that we just wanted to float a roof over the site and let our clients live under that roof. And again, there's this very powerful, potent connection with what's admittedly a very powerful landscape. Okay. Silver Bay is a smaller building up on the west coast of South Africa. It's a fairly arid area, and it has a very big fishing industry in this area. You can see the fishing factories and then the peninsula with these houses out on it. And it's one of the things that you find in this area are these little traditional white-walled thatched fishing cottages. This is a little fishing town called Arniston, and these buildings really are kind of typical of and unique to the Cape. And then this town is called Paternoster, and it's the site for the house is just over those hills. So the idea on this project was to try and take these ideas of these traditional buildings and marry them with a more contemporary understanding of how one would want to connect to quite a magical landscape and live in a more contemporary way. So this is the section. Again, it does what a lot of our buildings do. The living levels are up on the top level, so you have this very powerful view down to the ocean, and the bedrooms on the level below. We kept the gable ends open, which allow kind of rising and setting sun and rising and setting moon to be part of the space. We're in the southern hemisphere, so we're interested in the north sun. So we have this courtyard on the north side here, and there's a terrible summer wind that comes from this side, but the view's on this side. So this glazing's typically completely closed off, and people live out into this little courtyard. Okay. Next one. So this is the building, which is a translation of a fishing cottage. You can see it up on the dunes here. This is the entrance into it, so you again come into quite a contained small entrance space, and then you kind of open up into this incredible view. Here you can see this idea of these extended views again. Since what's quite interesting about this building is that this is essentially just one big room. You've got the courtyard here, which you can open up here and here. Dining room, there's this level change here. Sorry, not dining room. This is the kitchen. There's a little eating area there and a living space here. But very small interventions to kind of start separating spaces. But this incredible horizon line that cuts through the building. And that's the space in the evening. And then looking back at the pool and this space, which is the kitchen. There's a little kind of scullery or workroom at the back here. Okay. Downstairs, we left this concrete incredibly raw. It's still got all of these rust marks from nails that were left on the shutters and chalk marks from the contractors. So there's this kind of real sense of the people who built this building ingrained in the building. Beachy Head is a project on the east coast in a place called Plettenberg Bay. Entrance levels at this level. There's kind of a whole set of entertainment spaces at the bottom and bedrooms up at the top. It sits on again a very beautiful. Sorry, Eddie, I think that was me. Sits on a very beautiful bay up here. And I think what was quite interesting about this building is there was an existing house here that we partly demolished and then rebuilt. And the challenge was to figure out how to kind of nestle a building in the dunes and create an environment that felt quite disconnected from two quite close neighbors. The section again, this time the living spaces are in the middle here. That's the entrance level. Let's move on. You can see, again, this idea of these very large view lines that get generated through the space. That's the lower level. And then the bedrooms at the upper level. So this is the front of the building. We might more consciously used more natural materials on this project and have tried to keep it quite modulated and broken up at street level. Again, this idea that you kind of create a very dramatic, very direct connection to the landscape as you come into the space. And once you get to the front of the building, this idea that you're very connected to and very immersed in this natural environment. Okay. And then in this space, this very powerful connection to the landscapes beyond. And this transparency from the back of the building to the front of the building. The next project is a very exciting project that we've just finished working on. It sits kind of over the city of Cape Town, but instead of looking out towards the sea, it looks over the city and has the mountain wrapping around it. So one of our challenges here was to figure out how this site actually related to the mountains and to the various peaks that surround it, and how we brought these views into the space, and then how we kind of hid the neighbors that sit directly next to the site. The site sits on a very busy. This is there's a main arterial road up here that connects across this little pass. So it sits on a very busy street that at peak times is kind of really a horrible access point, but it floats. It floats above the city with these incredible views down to the city. So the first thing we did is it's two houses. There's a project at the bottom and then this project up at the top. And you can see how the mountain really runs up here. Lion's Head, which is this peak, I think is about 800 meters high, and then Table Mountain, which sits on this side of the project, is a kilometer high. But it's kind of 3 k's back from you, so it's a really vertical view. So we cut, if you just go back one, Eddie, so you can see there's essentially a clear story window that wraps around the site, and then there's another clear story skylight that cuts up here. So you have these views back up to the mountain here, and views forward, and because you come in at an elevated level, you've got views down to the city. This is the entrance level. Again, this idea that there's really just a space, and the space is articulated by level changes and by ceiling changes. That you have these very strong view lines, and that you have these borrowed and extended view lines. It's a lower level. Okay. And then next one. And then this is the building then here sitting in the landscape. This ultimately will all go quite dark, and this quite big mass kind of then just recedes into the landscape. The living level with the Table Mountain wrapping around it. On each of these levels, we've brought gardens up onto the levels and integrated them into the floors. Again, you can kind of see how the sliding doors can be pushed right away, and you basically again kind of sitting on a covered terrace or on a veranda. And because of the clear story that wraps around the building, you have these much steeper views up to the mountain. So, living in a big city, instead of having a set of walls around you with windows cut into them, you're very much integrated into this very exciting landscape. Okay. And you have these views back up to the mountain. The busy street I mentioned earlier is right behind this wall. Okay, the next, I'm going to quickly show you two more houses and then go on to some more public projects. This is a project in Madeira on an incredibly steep site. We ran an exercise of trying to understand the massing that we could work in. There's a very striking bay that sits down beyond the house, and one of the responses, which you'll see in more detail in the 3Ds, was to do a curve that mirrored the curve of the bay beyond. And then we figured out we had a schedule of accommodation that we needed to accommodate, and I think the site falls about 15 meters from top to bottom in the house itself. So the response at the end of the day was really just to create a shelter and then to create a set of pods that hold these living spaces and drop down the site. And you can see how kind of complex this plan started getting, and these boxes that live on each level as you drop down to the lower pool deck. These are these curves that play off against each other, and the slabs are also cut away to make the sky as much a part of the view as the sea is, and to bring sun really directly into the house. The towns on Madeira, which you can kind of vaguely make out in the distance here, have these beautiful red clay roofed villages. So we have a concrete shell that's clad in clay tiles, and on each level, as you cut down the site, these terraces get formed with these landscaped gardens, and you can see the bedroom boxes kind of cascading down the site, and offices, which are these spaces. So this is a very exciting project for us. Okay. Then the last house I'm going to discuss is it's actually a hospitality project, a big villa that can take many guests. This is Dakar on the west coast of Africa, Senegal, and little town called Popangine down in the south. Really beautiful, interesting place, and our client has a site that's covered in baobab trees. So we wanted to reflect some of the local building elements. These are Fulber roofs from the area. What's nice about them is that they really just reinforce this idea of architecture as shelter. And we wanted to kind of take these are some of this photos from Popengine. We wanted to take the idea of these baobab trees and marry them with the idea of these roofs and create this kind of big sheltering canopy structure, which we've used much more contemporary materials, but I think it does reflect some of these very traditional forms and finishes, but in a very contemporary way. So this is the plan. There's two approach routes in. There's a kind of a villa here, and then a set of rooms and a big set of living and reception spaces here. The plan. And then this quite interesting design where we have a series of walls and roofs that create privacy and at the same time give you these connections to views and allow the sky to be a view element from time to time. Okay. So this is the end result. There's a glazing line in here, and all of the doors can be pushed away, and you have this series of spaces that essentially feel like they're a series of covered external spaces. Again, rather than a set of internal spaces facing onto a set of external spaces. Okay. Okay. If we move on to some of the work we've done in the public realm, the first project is a project for a school in a rural area of South Africa called Mangaili. This was the school that was on the site, and we had a client there was a very inspiring headmaster at this building, at this school, and we had a client who decided that they would invest in a new school for the community. These buildings are somewhat complex in that they also have to function as community centers and as adult education centers. So you can see from the planning that there are a set of classroom blocks, and then there's a big central hall space, and then a set of admin buildings. But many of the same principles at place, these kind of extended view lines that run through the spaces, these big, strong visual connections to landscapes, these buildings that have these transition spaces that are neither inside or outside. Okay. Yeah, again, these kind of very strong external connections. This is the first floor classroom block. Okay. We had, there's a kind of a sports field in front here, but it's also a space that's used for community and cultural events. It's the section, okay. So this is the village, and you can just see the school kind of being slightly visible over here. These landscapes are quite typical, quite dry, but quite beautiful. This was the building. This was kind of an opening event. There was music and dance, and there's a very big evangelical church around the corner. So a brass band pitched up, and this space needs to work as a community space as well. it's quite a strong building in the landscape, and one of the challenges was to figure out how we could break the scale down. These are the classroom blocks. It has a kind of a civic feel, you know. It kind of, in the absence of other civic buildings, it needs to kind of have this civic presence in this space. You can see, again, trying to use as much natural light as possible, using these shading elements, having this quite strong visual connection to the landscape. We pulled some of the patterning that we'd seen on the earlier building into this building. This is the view from the hall back again down into the landscape. And then thinking about how you manage natural light in a space like this. The sun is quite strong in this area, and you get these beautiful shadows. The next project is the new engineering building at the University of Cape Town, which is a much more complex educational facility. Just quickly looking at the plan, it comprises of two buildings with this courtyard in the middle. If we move on to the next plan, the mountain sits up behind the site. So we needed to cut a view line through the building to get those mountain views in the back. Okay. The building in section. What you'll start seeing is the University of Cape Town has a very particular look and feel with these clay-tiled, hipped roofs. So one of our challenges was to figure out how we took that context into account. So this is the university, and this is the building we then worked on and interpreted this kind of scale and context of the surrounding urban fabric. What you start seeing is you start seeing kind of a series of much smaller spaces. This courtyard becomes an atrium space here. These are all south-facing skylights to draw sun into the space. This slot here allows you to, from the inside of the building, look up at the mountain beyond. All of these cutouts here start giving you these extended view lines. There's an extended view line and a cutout that takes you down to this street. Okay. We also needed to manage the sun as it moved around the building, and you'll see more of these sunscreens that wrap around the building. This is the courtyard. A lot of these buildings are really just quite simple blocks, and we wanted to really kind of break that scale down and allow people inside the building to have these connections to these landscapes from the outside. Okay. These are the sunscreens I was talking about. And then this is this courtyard space in the middle of the building. Most of the university is really just kind of concrete surfaces. So this is quite an unusual intervention. These are the sunscreens. All of the teaching offices sit behind these. And then kind of as you move through the building, you get these vistas that start opening up through the space. And you get this incredible view kind of cut out to the mountain beyond. And then these south-facing skylights that just draw natural light into this space. And then I'm going to show you one last project we're working on, which is a project called Hatta in the UAE, in a very beautiful, very harsh landscape. And it's a good example of how you can use a program like Revit to really kind of understand a landscape and understand how you can insert buildings quite lightly into quite a precious landscape. And because we're in control of what happens in interiors, we can start integrating, this becomes one design rather than a series of different designs put together by different people. And that's it. I think I'm going to end there. Thanks, guys.